Hello, my name is Juan Leal-Ugalde. I am an assistant professor of Spanish at Elon University in North Carolina, and today I will talk about stereograph cards concerning the Quechuan community. A stereograph reproduces a three-dimensional view of a photograph object through two almost identical images that are mounted on a plaque or card and observed through a stereoscope, a machine designed to provoke the 3D effect through a binocular view. Stereographs were one of the initial inventions for the photomechanical reproduction of images. Following historian William Darrah, they became popular in the United States after Oliver W. Holmes invented a familiar hand stereoscope in 1859. Stereograph cards' popularity lasted until the early 20th century. One of the best-known stereographic companies was Underwood and Underwood, founded by two brothers in Ottawa, Kansas in 1881. Underwood and Underwood moved to New York in 1887, and its success allowed the company to send photographers across the world. Their stereographs were published and sold as educational resources for American schools. See their 1915 publication, The World Visualized for the Classroom, for example. In 1922, Underwood and Underwood images were bought by the Keystone Stereo View Company and swiftly became the biggest name in the industry. They reproduced Underwood and Underwood stereograph based on sets divided by topics such as historical event or character, geography, or foreign culture, as John Goldsmith illustrated and Price Guide demonstrates. A stereograph also circulated as images complemented by written teacher's manual that describe other cultures categorized by Western encyclopedic logic. In other words, a stereograph condensed the world from a distinctly positivist perspective. This perspective triggers further questions regarding the ideal or exotic depiction of otherness and how foreign culture and racial issues were thought in the United States in the first decades of the 20th century. From the perspective of Latin American studies in which I contextualize this presentation, a stereograph's singular corpus has yet to be reviewed in depth. A stereograph concerning Latin America are an open book for research. I highlight the role of a stereograph as relevant archival resources today in order to re-examine the racialization of indigenous culture through the camera lens of Western photographers. Stereographic images are visual markers that I employ to reassess their impact in understanding, depicting, and romanticizing Latin America. In the following, I show my initial observation of an ongoing research project that examines the images of the Quechuan indigenous community of Peru, housed in the Library of Congress digital resources. The Quechuan community is the main indigenous group in Peru. Its members also inhabit Ecuador, Bolivia, Colombia, Argentina, and Chile. The Base de Datos de Pueblos Indígenas u Originarios, database of indigenous or native people, published by the Ministry of Culture in Peru, indicates that in this country, more than 20 variations of the Quechuan language are spoken. The Quechua-speaking population is the heirs of the pre-Columbian Inca culture. This image, presumed to have been taken by an unknown Underwood and Underwood photographer circa 1907 and reproduced by the Keystone Company years later, shows the fortress of Sacsayhuaman. It is an archaeological site outside of the city of Cusco and a symbolic place that has been frequently photographed throughout history. In 1934, Sacsayhuaman was excavated and studied by the writer Luis Valcárcel, who developed the notion of Neo-Inca that predominated among the Lecher culture in Cusco after Valcárcel's crucial book Tempestad en los Andes, published in 1927. The Neo-Inca concept implied a new approximation to the monumental Incan past, and sought to extract from it cultural aspects that would produce a new national subjectivity. Following a romantic approximation of the pre-Columbian history, this subjectivity encouraged a new understanding of the so-called Indian beyond that of the racial hierarchies that prevailed in the 19th century and the colonial era. At least 3 stereographs were taken at Sacsayhuaman. In this image, the subject on the left is looking at the horizon outside of the frame. This is a depiction of the indigenous people of the mountain region that employ a photographic strategy of representation that shares similarities with the aesthetic of the Neo-Inca and the photographic tradition that took off in 1910 in Cusco. That similarities emerged despite difference between an American photographic company and the national Indigenista project led by Valcárcel in Peru. An aesthetic analysis shows parallels between stereograph and the avant-garde photography that erupted in Peru in the early 20th century. Both represent indigenous people posing in Inca ruins or in front of the stone of Cusco Street, as we see in this image. The stereograph offers a singular view of this city, the capital of the Inca Empire Tahuantinsuyo and a fundamental site of mestizaje, a crucial word that implies dynamics of acculturization, transculturization, syncretism, and hybridity of races between indigenous people and Spaniards. Concerning Cusco, scholars such as Deborah Poole, Marisol de la Cadena, and Jorge Coronado have characterized it as a prominent cultural center in the development of Indigenism from 1910 to 1930. Indigenism was a literary, artistic, and political movement for which avant-garde photography became a relevant tool. It was also the context of the Neo-Inca project, one among many branches of Indigenism. Debates on Indigenism and Neo-Inca romantic racialization of Aboriginal people are ongoing, and the cultural history of Cusco at the beginning of the 20th century has been studied in detail. Stereographs, however, have barely played a role in scholarly debates about the Andean photographic tradition, which instead has focused on photographers such as Juan Manuel Figueroa Aznar, Max de Vargas, or the Quechua Martín Champi. I want to ask if these stereographs are implicitly dialoguing with Indigenista photography. I see a relationship, one of similarity and difference, between stereograph and the Fotografía Cusqueña. The latter developed by the aforementioned important Indigenista photographers in the Latin American context, and the former by the likely American Underwood and Underwood photographers. I consider these images as an opportunity to analyze historical impact of modernization in the Andean world, a critical reflection that was fostered by the Indigenista movements. In this image, the material culture expressed in two pieces of clothing offers an opportunity to examine the racialization of Andean culture in Peru. The woman on the left of the water fountain, dressed in traditional clothes, contrasts with the man at her right wearing Western-style clothing. This contradiction allegorizes a complex dynamics between indigenous culture and the desire to follow a European pattern as the symbol of civilization, a phenomenon that continues to spark debate today. Similarly, the charts in the background remind us of the context of the historical process in which indigenous traditions survived colonization and mixed with a European cultural, artistic, and religious regime. In Cusco, the dispossession and precarity of the Indian contradict the emergence of Baroque colonial Latin American art under Spanish rule from the 17th to the 18th centuries, as well as with the Indigenista avant-garde writers and photographers in the 20th century. From my research project, I contextualize stereograph card by taking into account this complex historical scenario. Regarding the Andean culture of Peru, the question of race has been deeply explored. In Deborah Poole's renowned Vision, Race, and Modernity, the author analyzed aesthetic ideologies of dominant visual regime that have represented from a European perspective, no European Andean culture. The question, as has been discussed by visual anthropologists, is how to photograph the otherness or alterity. This image allows us to briefly consider this question by exposing the nostalgic gaze of the subject toward the city. Within the image converts the gaze of the alterity, colonial architecture, and the present relevance of visual archival materials. In short, The image heterochronic condition prevents any homogeneous answer to the question of the other, while it offered a chance to revisit past photos of the Quechua people and research the meaning of the stereograph that depicted them. My research on photography supports the latter half of this project, in which I examine a stereograph of a lesser-known region in the Andean highlands, Cerro de Pasco. Cerro de Pasco is a remote city located at more than 12,000 feet in the Peruvian Andes. It is one of the main mining regions in the country. Active since the 17th century, silver, copper, zinc, and lead had been long extracted there. In 1902, the Cerro de Pasco Investment Company officially settled in New York, and its operations seeded capitalism within Peruvian national history. Following social historian Alberto Flores Galindo, the mine became well known in the highland area under the name La Compañía, and by 1910, it had both an important number of Peruvian foundries, mining foundries, as well as hacienda properties that soon became useless for agricultural purposes because of industrial pollution. It seems like an Underwood photographer visited La Compañía in 1907. Stereographs from that tour are critical for rethinking the historical impact of modernization in the Peruvian Andes, as I argue with this image in which the mountain observed by the subject is impacted by railroads, highways, and air pollution. From this unique stereograph, I ask how the paradigm of industrial modernization generated by mining development severely impacted the area and its inhabitants. Cerro de Pasco faces severe environmental issues today. In 2021, for instance, the journal Nature reported high levels of metal contamination, provoking illness in children and a health crisis in the area. When La Compañía was established, a labor system known as enganche, meaning hooked, was already operating across Peru. Historians such as Flores Galindo described it as a form of semi-enforced labor based on advancing gold or cash to rural agricultural workers and forcing them to sign contracts. Many of the signers were illiterate. While social history has focused on labor conditions concerning a working class formed by the indigenous male population, this image shows cholas. Cholas is a polysemic word referring to indigenous or mestizo women in the Andes. In the stereograph, the cholas are working in the mine. They carry water from Lake Patarcocha with steel pails upon their backs. This stereograph echoes other impactful photographs by the renowned Sebastián Salgado on mining exploitation in Serra Pelada in Brazil in the 80s. In the context of Peru, this stereograph fosters reflection on the historical consequences of modernization and asks the viewer to explore the gender subalternization of indigenous women and the racial construction of the mining working class. This historical image condenses multiple intriguing elements to investigate gender subalternity, the visual economy of a stereograph depicting the cholas, and the precariousness of industrial labor in indigenous communities. This image, belonging to an explored corpus left by Underwood and Underwood about Latin America, is a call to consider open question that seems to be critical in present times. In this presentation, I have approached the initial steps to explore the history and enigmatic meaning of this stereograph. Thank you, and I invite you to explore further this connection.